Congress. How the House's eccentric liberal icon won a slew of centrist allies. Rosa DeLauro is known for her purple-streaked hair and progressivism, but a war room mentality on appropriations is powering her bills across the finish line. Rep. Rosa DeLauro's colleagues say they've largely approved of how she has used her first, and perhaps only, chance at the gavel to usher in long-held party objectives. Tassis Catapodispool / Getty Images. By Sarah Ferris and Heather Cagle. August 5, 2021, 4:30 a.m. EDT. Rosa DeLauro is racking up so many unexpected wins this year in one of the House's toughest jobs that, when faced with a rare defeat this summer, she refused to give up. On the House's penultimate day before the August recess, its appropriations chair was clinging to the possibility of success on a divisive spending bill that many of her colleagues already knew was dead. DeLauro didn't want to accept that the legislation, which funded the Department of Justice and tackled controversial policies from policing funds to firearms sales, simply didn't have the votes. There's still time, DeLauro told fellow Democrats, according to a person in the room. Democratic leaders pulled the bill from floor hours before the House left town for its August recess. But DeLauro's never-say-die mentality during a grueling appropriations process that could have been a disaster for the caucus shows how she has shattered assumptions about how she'd govern. The eccentric Democrat, recognizable by her brazen rhetoric, pattern-mixing attire, and cropped purple-streaked hair, isn't running the powerful committee as the hard-charging liberal she's often made out to be. Instead, she's governing from the middle. Before she was a leader, her job was not to bring people together, her job was to make her points, said House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer. I think she's made her points in these bills, but she's also listened to other interest groups and incorporated those viewpoints, he added. DeLauro's ability to unite the caucus, which could lose only 4 votes on the floor, is thanks in part to her creation of an intense behind-the-scenes whipping operation that one person close to the process said had a war room mentality. Working closely with Hoyer, DMD, and Majority Whip Jim Clyburn, DS.C., it's also resulted in her eyebrow-raising success in dragging several more bills across the finish line than even her own colleagues expected. A longtime senior member of the Appropriations Committee and trumpeter of regular order, Hoyer said he made clear to DeLauro early on that if they could work together to unite the caucus, he would make sure the floor time was available to pass as many appropriations bills as they could. By working various corners of the caucus where they had strong personal relationships, the pair ensured that even the most contentious policy issues were addressed before floor votes. I think she's very, very skillful and she has a new role and she's playing that role, Hoyer said in an interview. After 3 decades in office, the 78-year-old Democrat is running Congress's most powerful panel at a frenetic pace, juggling calls with her colleagues past 10:30 at night. And ahead of the floor votes, DeLauro and her staff doled out thick packets to every Democrat, complete with each member's top 5 priorities included in the bill. Watching her right now, that's all she's doing, working the floor, or doing it via the phones. And that pays off, and she has a lot of goodwill, said Rep. Mark Pauken, DWIS, a progressive who sits on the appropriations panel. The Connecticut Democrats' rise hasn't been without some friction. Privately, some of her colleagues say her own policy interests sometimes lead to turf wars with other committee chairs. Such as when Democrats drafted a massive COVID bill last year dealing with some of DeLauro's legacy issues, like paid family leave and the child tax credit. DeLauro had spent decades working with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, one of her closest allies, to expand the tax credit and dramatically cut child poverty. That expansion, though temporary, went into effect this July. In the past, some on the committee saw her as abrasive. DeLauro frequently sparred with Republicans during spending bill markups and sometimes privately with top Democrats, including Pelosi, on strategy calls. But with Democrats now in control of all of Washington, Deloro's colleagues say they've largely approved of how she has used her first, and perhaps only, chance at the gavel to usher in long-held party objectives. That includes a return to earmarks after a decade-long ban and a substantial hike in domestic spending across the board. This year, Deloro also decided to remove the Hyde Amendment, a 45-year-old ban on Medicaid spending for abortion, despite the long odds that the Senate will agree to strip it. Rep. Barbara Lee, D. California, another senior appropriator and progressive who was a Hill staffer when the policy was first created, called the effort long overdue and a racial justice issue. The debate could have turned nasty. Instead, the one Democrat who opposed it in committee, socially conservative Rep. Henry Cuellar, D. Texas, backed the final measure on the floor. No other Democrats objected. "She knows where I am," Cuellar said, noting that Deloro never pressured him either way. "There's that mutual respect. Abortion, oil and gas, guns, certain things, she understands and she respects that." The personal politics of the senior Texan couldn't be further from those of Deloro, an unapologetic feminist raised on the blood sport of New Haven politics. In a brief interview last week, Deloro summarized her approach: "That's what it comes down to, people's personal values. And that's the way they vote." Part of Deloro's success, according to her chief rival in last year's chair race, Rep. Debbie Wasserman Schultz, DFLA, is that she delivered on a campaign goal they had both shared by making every Democrat feel invested in spending bills. Normally, the appropriations process is very opaque. So, it's to her credit that she opened it up, said Wasserman Schultz, who helped Deloro as one of the 12 subcommittee chairs. "We were all hands on deck." Another key element, Deloro is the first appropriations chair in a decade with the power to increase the size of her bills, since the 2011 spending caps deal ended this year. And as bombastic as she might appear, Deloro has developed close relationships over the years with her GOP counterparts, such as Rep. Tom Cole, R. Oklahoma. "She's a very capable chairman. She certainly knows her bills and the process, and I think she's responding to her caucus," said Cole, who has spent years working with Deloro on health and education issues. Still, the senior Republican added, "Now, they're running stuff I know can never happen." The one setback Deloro faced this week, on the sprawling DOJ spending bill, was nearly a success. The bill was ready to go until a group of policing unions delivered Deloro a last-minute missive, blasting the terms of certain policing grants. Rep. Matt Cartwright, the Pennsylvania Democrat who oversees that bill, said he was stunned by the sudden opposition, after his panel added $65 million to community-oriented policing grants this year. "I was taken aback by that at the 11th hour," Cartwright said, noting that he had spent 6 weeks up close and personal with Excel spreadsheets on the bill. Still, Deloro is privately insisting she will get the bill done when the House returns in September, despite skepticism in the caucus. And Hoyer agreed, telling Politico they're planning another attempt at passing the bill next month. "Rosa is very, very hard-working and very, very focused," Hoyer said. "Intense would be a word that would not be inappropriate." Biden targets 50% clean car sales by 2030. White House climate advisor Gina McCarthy talks with EVgo CEO Kathy Zoe before the start of an event near an EVgo electric car charging station on April 22. Susan Walsh/AP photo by Alex Guillen. August 5, 2021, 10:45 a.m. EDT. Updated, August 5, 2021, 5:08 p.m. EDT. President Joe Biden signed an executive order on Thursday setting a target that half of all new vehicle sales by 2030 will be zero-emissions vehicles, primarily electric cars and trucks. It's the latest ambitious climate target from Biden, who has pledged to put the country on a path to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by at least half the 2005 level by 2030. And it's backed up by new proposed rules to strengthen upcoming federal tailpipe requirements through 2026, with even stricter regulations expected for the following years. They're a vision to the future that is now beginning to happen, a future of the automobile industry that is electric, Biden said of electric vehicles parked on the White House grounds during a speech on Thursday. It's electric, and there's no turning back. The question is whether it will lead or fall behind in the race for the future. Under Biden's new target, car makers would need to show a 13-fold increase in the current market share of zero-emission vehicles by the end of the decade. This is a paradigm shift, a senior administration official told reporters on Wednesday. Biden signed the order setting the national 50% by 2030 goal at an event Thursday at the White House alongside representatives from the three major U.S. automakers, Ford, General Motors and Stellantis, formerly Fiat Chrysler, and the United Auto Workers. In addition to fully electric vehicles, the target will also include plug-in hybrids, which have gasoline engines to back up their batteries, and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, which currently make up a tiny fraction of U.S. sales. The target isn't binding on consumers or automakers, but sets expectations for action over the coming decade, said the official who conducted the press briefing. One of the things we've seen in jurisdictions around the country and around the world is the power of providing increasing amounts of market clarity in terms of where we are headed, the official said. Automakers will announce their own additional goals on Thursday, according to the official, building off GM's pledge that all its vehicles will be electric by 2035 and similar targets from some other automakers. The big three U.S. automakers and many foreign manufacturers appear to be unified behind Biden's strategy, even after many lobbied former President Donald Trump just 4 years ago to slash the Obama-era standards that they felt were too aggressive. The industry ultimately had to talk Trump back from completely gutting federal tailpipe standards and from starting a regulatory war with California that threatened to split the country into two separate auto markets. In a statement, the three U.S. companies said that a dramatic shift in the market would only be reached if the Biden administration enacted the full suite of electrification policies committed to by the administration in the Build Back Better plan, including purchase incentives, a comprehensive charging network of sufficient density to support the millions of vehicles these targets represent, investments in R&D, and incentives to expand the electric vehicle manufacturing and supply chains in the United States. Those incentives, particularly Biden's plan to pour $174 billion into speeding the adoption of electric vehicles, have hit some roadblocks. The bipartisan infrastructure plan that is moving through the Senate saw funding for a network of chargers across the country cut to $7.5 billion. While lawmakers have expressed some skepticism about pushing electric vehicles given the lack of a domestic supply chain that will force automakers to rely largely on imported materials from China. But United Auto Workers President Ray Curry said in a statement the industry was at a critical time as countries compete to build the vehicles of the future. We are falling behind China and Europe as manufacturers pour billions into growing their markets and expanding their manufacturing. We need to make investments here in the United States, he said. In addition to Biden's executive order, the Environmental Protection Agency on Thursday proposed a major 10% increase in the stringency of tailpipe carbon dioxide emissions for 2023 vehicles and 5% for the years after, Reg. 2060 AV13. That represents a much steeper glide path than the Trump-era rule, which mandated only 1.5% annual improvements. By 2026, the emissions standards would translate to a fleet-wide rating of 52 miles per gallon for 2026 vehicles, according to EPA's analysis. The Trump rule would achieve a fleet-wide rating of just 45 mpg by 2026, according to the agency's analysis. While the rule will increase upfront costs for vehicles, EPA projects it would save consumers $900 over the vehicle's lifetimes, with the rule's net benefits ranging between $86 billion to $140 billion. It would also reduce carbon pollution by 2.2 billion tons through 2050, about one-third of the U.S. total greenhouse gas output in 2019, and reduce gasoline demand by 200 billion gallons. And Biden is directing the agencies to start work on additional fuel economy and emissions rules for later this decade, both for light-duty cars and trucks and for medium and heavy-duty vehicles. Like buses, delivery trucks, garbage haulers, and 18-wheeler cargo carriers, which represent an outsized portion of carbon dioxide pollution. Those rules will be proposed at a later date. Environmentalists welcomed Biden's new moves as a step in the right direction. But uncertainty about how aggressive the emissions and mileage regulations for the second half of the decade has many reserving judgment. And climate activists aren't doing any backflips over the voluntary agreement either. A voluntary agreement is completely unacceptable, said Catherine Garcia, acting director for the Sierra Club's Clean Transportation for All campaign. Too much is at stake for a voluntary agreement to meet the moment and to deliver on EPA's mission. Dan Becker, director of the Safe Climate Transport campaign at the Center for Biological Diversity, expressed skepticism that automakers would meet unenforceable voluntary targets. These are the companies that tore up the agreement they made with President Obama to cut pollution, so why would anyone trust them now, he said. Environmentalists have instead pushed for a mandatory nationwide increase of electric vehicle sales to 60% of all sales by 2030, and for all passenger vehicle sales to be electric by 2035. Such rapid change is necessary because new vehicles can remain on the road for 15 years or more, they say, so meeting emissions goals of eliminating greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 requires earlier action. That's a huge step up from the 2.75% market share held in June by fully electric vehicles, according to a report from the industry group Alliance for Automotive Innovation. All zero-emissions vehicles represented 3.8% of sales that month. Environmentalists are already gearing up to scour the rule for compliance flexibilities, or, for critics, loopholes. That includes an extra credit feature put in place via a preceding Obama administration rule that was meant to boost electric vehicle sales, known as a multiplier. It provided automakers with extra compliance credits for selling electric vehicles. Environmentalists may also target so-called off-cycle credits that reward technologies such as solar reflective paint or variable crankcase suction valve compressors that can reduce emissions but don't show up in the regulatory test cycle. In both cases, critics have argued that the flexibilities effectively shield automakers from having to make more stringent reductions in tailpipe emissions and undermine the program's effects. Any sort of giveaways and flexibilities, off-cycle credits, all of those weaken the rule, and don't deliver the real-world benefits that we need, said Garcia. The administration official on Wednesday did not reveal any specifics about such compliance flexibilities, saying instead that we look forward to the breadth of the stakeholders taking advantage of the public notice and comment process to help these rules be as strong as they can be. The administration must act quickly to finalize the proposal in time for manufacturers to apply it to model year 2023 vehicles. Separately, EPA and NHTSA are working to restore California's waiver giving it greater regulatory power over cars, Reg. EPA HQ or 2021-0257. That was stripped away by the Trump administration to stop the Deep Blue State, and the now 14 other states that follow its rules, from enforcing standards more stringent than the federal rules.
Congress. Senate Dems plot new paths on voting reform, sidestepping filibuster. A boost of election spending in the forthcoming $3.5 trillion spending bill is on the table, as is another floor vote. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer arrives at the Capitol. J. Scott Applewhite, AP photo by Marianne Levine and Nicholas Wu. The 5th of August 2021, 12:03 p.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. Updated, the 5th of August 2021, 3:19 p.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. As the fate of Senate Democrats' signature ethics and voting reform package remains in limbo, they're confident they can deliver in at least one area: election funding. Senate Democrats, led by Rules Chair Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, are considering providing additional cash for voting standards and voting by mail in the $3.5 trillion social spending plan that the party is set to take its first steps on as soon as this weekend. Klobuchar and others have emphasized that the boost of cash for election infrastructure is not a replacement for Democrats' stalled reform plan, but rather an alternate track to make progress. We're working to see what we can do with it, but it will not be a replacement for the federal voting standards. Because some states would just go, "Well, I don't want the money," Klobuchar said, adding that the amount of funding is still not finalized. Senate and House negotiators, however, are eyeing spending as much as $15 billion to $20 billion on election infrastructure. Still, the forthcoming multi-trillion-dollar spending bill may be the only realistic opportunity for congressional Democrats to do something concrete on voting ahead of next fall's midterms. With Joe Manchin of West Virginia and other Democrats opposed to changing the legislative filibuster, any major election overhaul stands little chance of becoming law at the moment. "It's really essential that we have a strategy that we can execute," said one Senate Democrat, speaking candidly on condition of anonymity, as opposed to every week we come back and say, "Have you changed your mind yet, Joe Manchin?" While the Senate is currently wrapping up a bipartisan infrastructure bill and preparing to move forward on the $3.5 trillion social spending package, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is privately telling his members that they should expect more votes on election reform legislation before the end of the work period, according to people familiar with the discussions. The Washington Post first reported the possibility of this month's vote, which comes after Democrats failed to advance their package in June amid unanimous GOP opposition. A group of Democratic senators has been working for weeks on legislation that would incorporate recommendations from Manchin, who had reservations about the initial ethics and election reform package. Senior Democrats met Wednesday afternoon to talk about next steps, and Sen. Tim Kaine of Virginia, who is participating in those discussions, predicted Thursday that the proposal could be unveiled next week, as the vehicle that now Dems are unified. Kaine added that he has recommended that we ought to consider whether there are pieces of the bill that can be done through reconciliation. In the House, Majority Leader Steny Hoyer is leading the effort to include election funding in the social spending package. But it's unclear if that will be enough to placate progressives in the House, who have been clamoring for more aggressive congressional action on voting rights. But the potential for an intra-conference compromise in the Senate means that the upper chamber is moving on a separate track than the House. The House already passed the Democrats' election and ethics reform package in March, and legislators in the lower chamber are expected to introduce a second voting rights-focused bill, which is named after the late civil rights icon John Lewis and focused on restoring parts of the landmark 1965 Voting Rights Act, as soon as this week. Meanwhile, voting rights activists are amping up the pressure, as two deadlines approach. The first is the long-delayed release of redistricting data from the Census Bureau, which map makers across the country use to redraw House and legislative lines every 10 years. That data is expected to be released August 12, and states will immediately begin drawing maps once it is released. The second is August 6, the anniversary of when President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law nearly 6 decades ago. Achieving change, especially legislative change, is not based on the urgency of the lawmakers, it is based on the urgency of those of us that are going to force the lawmakers, Rev. Al Sharpton told reporters on Thursday. Schumer has vowed that failure is not an option when it comes to election and ethics reform. But it's not clear what the next steps are, given that Manchin opposes any carve-out to Senate rules and there's little GOP appetite for Democrats' efforts. Heather Cagle and Zach Montellaro contributed to this report. Guns. Gun safety groups to Biden, do more to get your point, man confirmed. The White House says it's pushing for the president's ATF nominee. Activists say they could be doing a fair bit more. David Shipman, President Joe Biden's nominee for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, speaks at a House Judiciary Committee hearing on assault weapons on Capitol Hill in Washington, Wednesday, September 25, 2019. Andrew Harnick, AP photo. By Anita Kumar. The 5th of August 2021, 7:01 p.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. Updated, the 5th of August 2021, 7:11 p.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. The confirmation of David Shipman to lead the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives is increasingly in peril. And now gun violence survivors and activists are going public with their long-simmering private frustrations, saying President Joe Biden could have done more. In half a dozen interviews, those advocating for Shipman's confirmation complained that Biden and his top aides have not leaned enough on Democratic senators to get them to support the confirmation. The White House has really dropped the ball here, and if Shipman is not confirmed, that will be a significant letdown to survivors of gun violence across the country, and will have the effect of undermining their effort to reduce gun homicides, said Igor Volsky, executive director of the advocacy group Guns Down America. Biden told us during the campaign trail that this is a priority, and the administration insists that he is in charge of driving this issue. He needs to step on the accelerator. Frustrations became evident during a Zoom call on Thursday afternoon with Cedric Richmond, senior advisor to the president and director of the White House Office of Public Engagement, the latest in months of meetings in which advocates have brought up Shipman's nomination. According to two people familiar with the call, a small group of survivors and those pushing firearms restrictions urged the White House to be more aggressive on the nomination. They also encouraged the administration to support ending the filibuster to allow firearms legislation to more easily pass the evenly divided Senate, the people said. Activists and survivors say that they recognize that the president's time has been occupied by weighty items like the fast-spreading Delta variant of the COVID-19 virus and major social and infrastructure spending plans. But they argue that more political capital could have been spent on such a critical component of the administration's gun agenda, and that it should not have fallen so much on the Department of Justice and activists themselves to make the case for Shipman. Garland has reached out to several senators to ask for their support, according to the Justice Department. I appreciate and respect all of the work that the White House is doing on infrastructure and COVID, said Fred Guttenberg, whose daughter, Jamie, was killed in the Parkland, Florida, high school shooting in 2018. However, the escalating gun violence in this country is equally important. And the confirmation of David Shipman to be the ATF director matters as much as everything else that they are working on, and I hope they understand that. Shipman's nomination is in jeopardy after son Angus King, an independent from Maine and a member of the Democratic caucus, signaled to both the Biden administration and his Democratic colleagues that he is not supportive of the nominee. King is under pressure from gun rights groups, including the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, to oppose Shipman. King told colleagues in the past week that he is currently a no on the nomination, according to a Democratic senator. He also told the White House in recent days that he is unlikely to vote for Shipman, according to two others familiar with the discussions. All of those sources cautioned that King could change his mind. In response to the King news, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki has stressed disappointment that Republicans have opposed Shipman in lockstep, thereby requiring that all 50 caucusing Democrat senators support his nomination. Advocates have expressed a desire for the president to ramp up the pressure directly on King. Biden and King had a recent conversation in which Shipman did come up, but only as part of a larger discussion, according to two people familiar with the call. The White House held a Zoom call with some groups Wednesday to talk about Biden's plan to curb violence across America's cities. But aides didn't mention Shipman's nomination, and advocates were frustrated that they were not given the chance to ask questions, according to two people familiar with the meeting. There is a ton of frustration among the large gun violence prevention groups that it's not a priority, an advocate said. After the White House was contacted for this piece, another gun safety group, Everytown for Gun Safety, reached out to praise the administration for being the strongest gun safety administration in history, and for fighting for David Shipman in the face of a torrent of lies and disinformation from the gun lobby. Shortly after, Peter Ambler, executive director for Giffords, another gun safety group, sent a statement saying President Biden has made good on his promise to combat our nation's gun violence crisis by laying out concrete steps we can take to save lives. Ambler added that Biden's nomination of Chipman underscored the president's belief that a component of the administration's gun violence prevention agenda is a strong leader at the ATF. An administration official said the White House has worked to build support for Chipman's confirmation among a range of leaders and organizations, including gun violence prevention groups, law enforcement organizations and others. The official noted that Richmond reiterated that Chipman's confirmation is a priority on Thursday's call. Biden and administration officials, including Attorney General Merrick Garland and Psaki, have pushed for confirmation during public remarks around the president's crime and gun agenda. The Department of Justice has arranged and prepared Chipman for one-on-one meetings with 17 senators, according to a DOJ official. Multiple people in the department's Legislative Affairs Office are working on the confirmation, and have helped coordinate meetings with law enforcement organizations and gun safety groups, the official said. The White House commented for this piece after publication. President Biden knows that having strong leadership at ATF is vital to cracking down on gun crime and keeping our communities safe. That's why he moved historically quickly to nominate David Chipman to lead the Bureau, and it's why he's had his team work hard both on Capitol Hill and behind the scenes to build support for his confirmation, said White House spokesman Mike Quinn. Still, some advocates said it remained unclear to them, months into the confirmation fight, what the White House was doing in terms of congressional outreach. Absent a fuller court press from the White House, activists have pushed the Chipman nomination themselves. In a meeting Wednesday, Poe Murray, who chairs the Newtown Action Alliance, which formed after the 2012 school shooting in Connecticut, and Gutenberg asked King to meet again with Chipman as well as more gun violence survivors. We will continue to encourage Senator King to speak to survivors and families, and we'll also encourage the White House to engage with Senator King, Murray said. King's office didn't respond to questions about those requests. Two other Democratic senators, Joe Manchin of West Virginia and John Tester of Montana, said this week they remained undecided on Chipman's nomination. But advocates pushing for Chipman's nomination who are in touch with Senate offices say they believe that both will vote for confirmation. Biden and Tester have spoken about Chipman, among other issues, according to one person familiar with the call. Manchin hosted a virtual town hall with Chipman focused on gun rights with West Virginia constituents. King's vote is all the more important because moderate Republicans, including Sen. Susan Collins of Maine and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, oppose Chipman's nomination. Senate leadership has acknowledged that Chipman doesn't yet have the votes for final confirmation. The Senate Judiciary Committee approved his nomination along party lines, but Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer hasn't scheduled a vote to discharge him from committee. Biden has announced several executive actions to curb gun violence as well as money devoted to try to prevent community violence that have been widely praised by activists, but some of them say the White House has not gone far enough on the issue. We thought that once we elected a gun safety president and gun safety majorities in the House and the Senate that this new federal administration would make gun violence prevention a top priority, said an advocate in touch with the White House. And they've done a great job on the funding initiative, but I just thought that the president would use political capital just in general to pass legislation. Somebody that's all in. Chipman, a senior policy advisor at Giffords, previously served more than 2 decades at the ATF. He favors banning assault weapons, limiting high-capacity magazines, expanding background checks and ending the fairly broad liability shield that firearms manufacturers enjoy. And he has called for ATF to increase inspections of federally licensed gun dealers and use other tools to help curb what he calls a national epidemic. The Senate has confirmed only one ATF nominee, B. Todd Jones, in 2013, a sign of how controversial the position is. We support strong leadership at ATF, said Tony Montalto, who founded the group Stand with Parkland after his daughter, Gina, died in the Parkland shooting. Progress is hard, and our government depends on compromise. And I think this is something that people forget. We all become so focused on one issue, we forget that we need compromise to make things work. Tina Spondles contributed to this report.
White House back-channeling with networks on COVID coverage. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki speaks during a press briefing at the White House on February 2, 2021, in Washington. Evan Vucci / AP photo. By Christopher Cade Lago. August 3, 2021, 4:30 a.m. EDT. The Biden administration is privately ramping up outreach to major media outlets in hopes of tamping down a spate of alarming news reports that threaten to slow its vaccination campaign. The White House began holding a series of briefings Monday and into Tuesday with all the major TV networks, including Fox News, as well as other newsroom leaders about their recent COVID coverage. According to three sources familiar with the meetings. Focused on the surging Delta variant and vaccinations, the briefings are being led in part by Vivek Murthy, the U.S. Surgeon General, one of the sources told Politico. The briefings are being held on deep background, meaning news organizations can use the material but have agreed not to name or directly quote from senior officials, and come as the administration hit its vaccine milestone on Monday, with 70% of American adults having now gotten at least one shot. But they are also occurring at a moment of concern across the administration over news reports and headlines that they view as far too narrowly focused on vaccinated people contracting the virus. A slew of those stories relied on Centers for Disease Control and Prevention data, obtained by the Washington Post and then reported on by a flurry of outlets last week. The CDC study examined an outbreak of vaccinated and unvaccinated people in Provincetown, Massachusetts, and led the agency to revise its mask guidelines. But news of the findings came out before the actual data itself. And the early headlines and reports emphasized the number of so-called breakthrough infections, vaccinated people who contract the virus. Officials in the administration feared that the stories and social media posts promoting them would further hamper their efforts to persuade unvaccinated people to get the shots. They first pushed back on Twitter, and later in a CNN report in which aides aired their frustrations, arguing that the items lacked some crucial context. While vaccinated people can get breakthrough infections, especially from the Delta variant, and also spread the virus just like the unvaccinated, it's still exceedingly uncommon that they will be infected or end up hospitalized because of it. It's on everyone to get this right, and coverage that mischaracterizes breakthrough infections misses the mark and poses a very real threat of hardening vaccine hesitancy, a White House official said. We've been closely engaged on this with the outlets covering it, and we're going to continue to do so to ensure that the American people are getting accurate information. A 7-slide deck used by the administration for the media briefings and obtained by Politico stresses that the virus the country is battling today is much different than before, the Delta variant, which, according to a slide, accounts for 80% of the new cases after being just 1% in May, spreads far more easily. The top point for the administration remains that vaccines are still extremely effective and that increasing the number of vaccinations is what will ultimately pull the country out of the COVID morass. According to a slide in the deck, the administration is telling news producers and reporters in the briefings that while breakthrough infections are expected, they are rare, and nearly all of them are mild cases. For example, a review of breakthrough cases from July 10 to July 26 in Barnstable County, Mass., where a concentrated outbreak in Provincetown occurred, concluded that 1% of breakthroughs resulted in hospitalization. The greater the percentage of people vaccinated, the higher the absolute number of breakthrough infections, a passage in one of the slides reads. This does not necessarily mean that there is a greater proportion of breakthrough infections. The slides also highlight the COVID situation in the United Kingdom. Between January and July, vaccinations in the UK increased significantly. And though, by July, the Delta variant had led case counts to return to January levels, there were fewer hospitalizations and many fewer deaths. The White House has held similar background briefings for news outlets on the virus and vaccinations, including on vaccine confidence. They have framed the sit-downs as a chance to give the public accurate and up-to-date information on a fast-moving story. This past weekend, they huddled with TV producers and reporters in the lead-up to the Sunday shows, on which Biden's chief medical advisor, Anthony Fauci, ABC and CBS, and National Institute of Health Director Francis Collins, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, appeared. There are some indications that the administration's efforts to frame coverage around the need for vaccinations is working. On Monday, White House COVID-19 Data Director Cyrus Schopper said the 7-day average of newly vaccinated Americans was at its highest point since July 4. States with some of the highest COVID case rates have dramatically increased their daily rate of newly vaccinated people, including Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas. Congress. McConnell vows no GOP help with debt limit hike. If they want all this spending and debt to be their signature legacy, they should leap at the chance to own every bit of it, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell attends a press conference at the U.S. Capitol on August 4, 2021 in Washington, D.C. Kevin Deitch/Getty Images. By Caitlin Emma. August 5, 2021, 12:26 p.m. EDT. Updated, August 6, 2021, 9:13 a.m. EDT. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell promised Thursday that Republicans will not support a debt ceiling hike, just as Democrats have signaled they plan to take a path that would require Republican support. Democrats had talked about including an increase to the nation's borrowing authority in their $3.5 trillion budget plan, but this week indicated they would forego the measure in the party line bill. If our colleagues want to ram through yet another reckless tax and spending spree without our input, if they want all this spending and debt to be their signature legacy, they should leap at the chance to own every bit of it, the Kentucky Republican said on the floor. So let me make something perfectly clear, if they don't need or want our input, they won't get our help with the debt limit increase that these reckless plans will require, McConnell said. I could not be more clear. They have the ability to control the White House, to control the House, to control the Senate. They can raise the debt ceiling. Notably, McConnell did not mention the possibility of GOP cooperation when it comes to a debt ceiling suspension, a much more palatable strategy deployed by both parties in recent years that essentially pauses the issue until a later date. 2 years ago, Republicans and Democrats struck a budget deal with former President Donald Trump's administration that suspended the debt limit until July of this year. As soon as this weekend, Democrats will take up the $3.5 trillion budget resolution that kicks off consideration of their massive party line spending bill, which would make enormous investments in healthcare, climate change, and more. The resolution unlocks the reconciliation process, which will allow Democrats to pass the liberal package without GOP support. Democrats could also use that privileged process to raise the debt ceiling without Republican votes. But Politico reported on Wednesday that Democrats are likely to exclude language on raising the cap in their budget framework, instead forcing Republicans to negotiate on the high-stakes issue alongside a government funding deadline at the end of September. McConnell's warning had begun to cause anxiety among top Democrats by Thursday afternoon. On a private leadership call, Speaker Nancy Pelosi and her team began to strategize on how to proceed given the GOP blockade, according to several people familiar with the conversation. They discussed several options, including attaching a debt limit hike to the reconciliation bill after all. Other options would be tucking a stopgap spending bill come Sept 30, or into the Senate bipartisan deal, though that's seen as less likely because it could blow up a key Biden priority. The decision comes as moderate Democrats hesitate to embrace a debt hike when the federal tab already tops $28 trillion. The reconciliation process will also take time and could drag into the fall, a potential problem since Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has already warned that the nation could reach its breaking point by mid-September. The Congressional Budget Office recently predicted that Treasury will run out of money in October or November. Instead, Democrats are daring Republicans to return from August recess and oppose bipartisan action on government spending and the debt limit with just days to spare, risking blame for a government shutdown and catastrophic debt default. GOP lawmakers have so far insisted that they'll demand reforms to federal spending practices in exchange for action on the debt ceiling. Sen. Mitt Romney, R. Utah, said Thursday that Democrats would be wise to raise the debt limit in reconciliation and not expect Republicans to do it for them. They're the ones asking for $3.5 trillion in new spending, they're the ones that ought to raise the debt limit to fund it and not expect us to. Such a game of chicken would be highly irresponsible on their part, Romney said, and dangerous for them to not do what they can do by themselves. But Sen. Mark Warner, DBA, a moderate member of the Senate Budget Committee, noted on Wednesday that both parties agreed under Trump to not mess with the full faith and credit of the United States of America. To create a fake crisis at this moment with this much going on in the world and this much going on in this country, with us coming out of COVID and dealing with the variant, would be the epitome of irresponsibility, Warner said. I just point back to how we treated it under Trump. Burgess Everett, Sarah Ferris, and Heather Cagle contributed to this report. Congress. Dems plot to squeeze healthcare promises into social spending bill. To squeeze as many of their priorities as possible in the budget resolution, lawmakers are discussing making some of the new health spending temporary. We're not going to be able to do everything we want, said Sen. Chris Murphy, D-Con. Chip Samodavilla/Getty Images. By Alice Miranda Alstein and Rachel Rubin. August 5, 2021, 12 p.m. EDT. Democrats' $3.5 trillion social spending package marks the party's last chance before the midterm elections to make good on health care promises they're counting on to keep control of Congress. All they need is several trillion more dollars to squeeze as many of their priorities as possible in a budget resolution that's expected right after the bipartisan infrastructure package. Lawmakers are discussing making some of the new health spending temporary, similar to the 2-year boost to Obamacare subsidies they wrapped into Democrats' coronavirus relief package in March. The move could allow them to claim credit for steps such as extending Medicaid coverage to millions of low-income people in red states and extending the 2 years of Obamacare subsidies they enacted in March without running afoul of congressional scorekeepers. But a drug pricing plan that lawmakers are counting on to pay for a big chunk of the health investments is nowhere close to ready. That leaves Democrats uncertain of how much money they'll have to invest in new programs. We're not going to be able to do everything we want, said Sen. Chris Murphy, D-Con. There's not a simple answer. We're going to have limited resources, and we'll have to make different decisions on whether we do programs at lower levels for longer periods of time or higher levels for short periods of time. It's important to get it right. The debate could test solidarity within the caucus as progressives push for ambitious and costly initiatives such as expanding Medicare to cover dental, vision and hearing care, while moderates raise concerns about the cost. The overlapping priorities also raise the prospect of another grinding debate over health spending this fall. Already, some ambitious promises that played well on the campaign trail are being shelved. A senior Democratic aide told Politico that the package will not lower the eligibility age for Medicare, a top progressive demand. The forthcoming budget resolution text won't allocate specific funding levels for each health initiative, but instead broadly give different committees pots of money to work with. The $3.5 trillion reconciliation plan is being brought up under an expedited process so that it can pass without any GOP votes. But Democratic aides acknowledge they'll have to make decisions in order to fit what they can into the budget resolution's top-line number. A second senior Democratic aide said last month that there are 5 new health policies the budget resolution framework hones in on, creating Medicare dental, vision and hearing benefits, extending Obamacare subsidies, expanding Medicaid coverage to millions in states that have refused to expand their programs, bolstering Medicaid's in-home care and reducing patient spending on prescription drugs. Chris Meekins, an analyst for Raymond James, wrote in a note to clients Thursday that while the budget currently plans to spend $600 billion to $750 billion on health investments, he estimates the actual total will be closer to $400 billion to $450 billion. He cautioned that significant savings will be required either way, with papers for this bill in flux. Progressives say they're pushing Democratic leadership and the White House to favor 2- or 3-year authorizations instead of cutting some health items altogether or making the programs skimpier. If the choice is between fewer people covered, less benefits or a shorter time frame, we would obviously choose a shorter time frame, said Progressive Caucus Chair Rep. Pramila Jayapal, D-Wash. What we're trying to do on all these programs is provide as universal a benefit as possible, include the most people who need that benefit and make it as comprehensive as possible, but look at reducing the number of years. But some Democrats say they plan to fight to ensure long-term, if not permanent, funding for President Joe Biden's $400 billion plan to allow millions more older adults and people with disabilities to get Medicaid covered in-home services, saying the initiative needs a long runway in order to reach fruition. We're creating something that's rather new, and therefore it requires a time duration which is sufficient, said Sen. Bob Casey, DPA, who is leading work on the home care piece of the bill. This can't be a 2- or 3-year commitment. I want it to be a 10-year commitment, because that's the kind of duration that makes the most sense to me. Key Senate Democrats are also pushing hard to ensure the package extends health insurance to 2.2 million low-income Americans in states that have refused Obamacare's Medicaid expansion. Worried it could be left out because the population doesn't have the same political clout as seniors or middle-class Obamacare enrollees. Georgia Sen. Raphael Warnock said the expansion would fulfill a promise Congress made when it enacted Obamacare and expanded Medicaid to more poor adults. A 2012 Supreme Court decision made that expansion optional for states, and a dozen have refused to take up the program. We're in the middle of the process, and I know that this is a priority, and I'll keep making the case, he said. While Democrats also hope to tap multiple sources of funding to pay for the initiatives, they're leaning most heavily on a plan that would allow Medicare to directly negotiate the cost of prescription drugs, potentially saving the government hundreds of billions of dollars. But there isn't yet agreement on how best to go about it. The Senate Finance Committee is currently working on an alternative to House Democrats' prescription drug bill, which pegs what Medicare should pay for medicines to the lower prices paid in other developed nations. Tying Medicare drug price negotiations to an international reference price has faced pushback from moderates. Senate Finance Chair Ron Wyden, D.O.R., recently acknowledged that a lot of members have concerns about the policy and he is still trying to find common ground. Wyden is exploring tying price negotiations to a different benchmark based on domestic prices instead, according to 2 sources with knowledge, but has not yet shopped the plan around to members of his caucus. Progressive Democrats see a political advantage to short-term authorizations of generous health programs. in the belief that new subsidies and programs will help them maintain control of Congress and give them the power to renew the spending a few years from now. Once people are able to see and experience these benefits, they'll be harder to roll back, Jayapal said. They aren't just the right thing to do, but they're incredibly popular. Heather Cagle contributed to this report. Chaos and confusion, back to school turns ugly as Delta rages. Masked students work on computers at Tibbles Elementary School in Murphy, Texas, Thursday, December 3, 2020. LM Otero/AP photo. By Dan Goldberg, Juan Perez Jr. and Daniel Payne. August 4, 2021, 4:30 a.m. EDT. School boards are at war with governors over masks. Superintendents are developing contingency plans on the fly. And schools that only just opened have had to shut down. Welcome to sophomore year for COVID-19. The Delta variant, which few had heard of when classes ended in the spring, is upending reopening plans across the country, threatening President Joe Biden's promise of a more normal school year and sustained economic recovery. Nearly 18 months into the pandemic, there's no consensus on how to keep students and staff safe. Local school leaders, whipsawed by changing federal guidance, find themselves building a patchwork of protections based as much on local politics as public health. It's a terrible position to be in, Dan Domenech, executive director of the American Association of School Administrators, said in an interview. We have a huge crisis and nobody wants to make a decision. You're leaving superintendents wide open to fall to pressure from their community. Viral videos of parents shouting obscenities during school board meetings. Recall votes for board members, even death threats, underscore the pressure school leaders face as they contend with a virus far more contagious than what circulated last year. The prospect of waves of school closures or, worse, a children's pandemic, is a nightmare for the Biden administration, which hoped July 4 would mark the beginning of the end of the pandemic. Instead, it marked the beginning of the latest wave. The number of daily infections is up six-fold since the beginning of July, leading to the prospect of another year of lost learning, widening socioeconomic and racial gaps, and parents forced to miss work so they can stay home with their kids. With the highly contagious Delta variant spreading and most kids not immune, it's a perfect recipe for transmission in schools, said Thomas Dobbs, Mississippi's state health officer. Ash Fork, a small district in Arizona, canceled classes just days after school opened because several teachers tested positive or were caring for someone who did. A Mississippi school district on Friday told parents that 2 high schools will go remote due to the high transmission rate of COVID-19. On Tuesday, the district announced its middle school would as well. And on Friday, the Austin Independent School District in Texas, where cases are skyrocketing, announced a virtual option for children under 12 years old because they are ineligible for the vaccine. That move comes even as Texas Gov. Greg Abbott, a Republican, said the state won't count virtual attendance when it doles out school funding, meaning the district is risking millions of dollars. It's one of several examples where school leaders, at odds with Republican politicians, insist students and staff wear masks even if new laws prohibit them from doing so. Phoenix school officials announced this past week they will require masks, defying state law and Arizona Republican Gov. Doug Ducey. It was unconscionable and very short-sighted of our legislature and governor to take steps to ban mask mandates, said Kathy Hoffman, a Democrat and Arizona's elected superintendent of public instruction. I talked to school leaders who have said their hands are tied, they're frustrated, and they are worried. They're worried about outbreaks, they're worried about having to send kids home to quarantine when that's the last thing they want to do. Officials in Broward County, FLA, home to one of the nation's largest school districts, announced Monday that they were abandoning plans to require masks only 5 days after the school board voted unanimously to make them mandatory. The whiplash came after Republican Governor Ron DeSantis on Friday issued an executive order allowing parents or guardians to choose whether their child wears a mask in schools, and granted the state power to withhold funding from schools requiring masks. The president on Tuesday chastised governors who'd blocked mask mandates. "I say to these governors, please help," Biden said. "If you aren't going to help, at least get out of the way of the people who are trying to do the right thing." Mark Lane, the superintendent in Decorah, a small town in northeast Iowa, where Republican Gov. Kim Reynolds recently praised a law she signed in May that bars local officials from enacting mask requirements, said the most challenging dynamic of the new school year is the loss of control. Lane said that he only had to cancel one event last year, thanks, in part, to masks. Now, he worries that everything from a fall football game to a school musical could seed an outbreak. "I'm proud of what we did as a school district and how we managed this past school year. Then to enter this year feeling less in control of what we're going to do than a year ago is just weird," he said. "I didn't think we would be here." Of the nation's 200 largest school districts, 69 are mandating masks, according to Dennis Roche, co-founder of Burbio, which aggregates school data. Districts around D.C., including Arlington, Fairfax, Montgomery, and Prince George, are mandating masks. So is New York City, which runs the nation's largest school system. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the American Academy of Pediatrics both recommend face coverings in school, but the mitigation measure has become, for many, a personal affront on freedom. Some of the same parents and Facebook groups opposing school closures and required masking are also opposing anti-racism education in their schools, creating powerful conservative organizations focused on changing policies at the local level. "The amount of letters we get, and speakers we get, just parroting misinformation from the internet is really disheartening," said Tom Lando, a board member of the Chico Unified School District in Northern California who is facing a recall election. "It's like, we Googled why masks were bad, and we copied and pasted and added a few cuss words." Clovis Unified in Fresno County, California, voted last week to give parents the option to exempt their children from wearing masks, which California Gov. Gavin Newsom, who is facing his own recall, mandated last month. Other small school districts are scrambling to draft resolutions, attempting to regain local control over the decision, pointing to demand for parental choice and a return to normalcy. The CDC, in addition to masks, suggests that students remain 3 feet apart and schools regularly screen students and staff for symptoms, but these recommendations are merely guidance, leading to a hodgepodge of rules playing out across the various states. Students in Jackson, Mississippi, have a mask mandate, but those in nearby Rankin County School District do not. In North Carolina, Durham students must wear face coverings and remain at least 3 feet apart. But in Gaston County, outside of Charlotte, students can go mask-free. "School officials are picking from a buffet of protections," said Brian Castrucci, president of the de Beaumont Foundation, a public health policy and charitable organization. "State by state, community by community. We've created an environment in the U.S. that is perfect for the perpetuation of the pandemic. The Delta variant, which is far more contagious than earlier strains, is a wrinkle few planned for and it's forced dozens of last-minute changes." Louisiana Gov. John Bell Edwards, a Democrat, on Monday announced he was reinstating a statewide mask mandate in all indoor locations, including K-12 schools and colleges. Arkansas Gov. Asa Hutchinson, a Republican, is calling the legislature back in session and imploring them to amend a law that he signed so that district leaders can decide for themselves whether to implement a mask requirement. In some states, officials are sitting on their hands waiting for guidance on everything from quarantining to remote learning. The New York State Department of Education last week took the unusual step of calling out Democratic Gov. Andrew Cuomo and the State Health Department for taking so long to provide guidance. The urgency and frustration you are feeling as September approaches is palpable and is shared by the department, wrote Betty Rosa, the state education commissioner. The overarching sentiment from board members, principals, and superintendents toggles between frustration and resignation. Many hope that the worst of the pandemic was behind them and that the vaccines coupled with a year's worth of experience would ensure that the coming school year marked a return to normal. Back in June, everyone thought that come September we will be back in business again, Domenech, the head of the Superintendents Association, said. That's not the case anymore. That optimism is gone. Rachel Rubin and Mackenzie Mays contributed to this report. How Trump stiff-armed Congress, and gaslight the courts, to build his wall. By David Rogers. August 6, 2021, 4:37 a.m. EDT. Pentagon records obtained by Politico paint the clearest picture yet of how far the Trump administration went to get around Congress and speed the diversion of military construction funds to build its border wall in 2019. The diversion, totaling $3.6 billion, disrupted scores of improvements for military operations and the quality of life for troops and their families. The newly released documents provide the first ever look at the inner workings of how that money was moved around, and it's not a pretty sight for congressional committees, which were left in the dark and denied basic answers about the accounting maneuvers. The Defense Department ignored statutory language in the appropriations laws specifying how the dollars were to be used. Millions of dollars were moved to never-before-seen project lines created by the controller and then written into the military services construction budgets without the knowledge of Congress. And even in the case of the Navy, Dodd skipped past customary transfer requirements and made those dollars immediately available to the Army Corps of Engineers to write checks on those accounts. Dodd continues to defend its performance. But the records were sensitive enough that it took a year-long struggle by Politico to obtain just those covering the Navy. The department took 9 months to respond to a Freedom of Information Act request, and even then, the Comptroller's office withheld or failed to include the most relevant documents. It took another 3 months before this was corrected, a full year after the FOIA was filed in July 2020. With Trump gone and a new White House trying to recover the wall funds, many in both parties want to put the episode in the rear-view mirror. But more than $1 billion is not coming back. And left behind in its place is a legacy of distrust and nagging questions as to how Congress can better protect its constitutional power of the purse. I think we have to keep this on our radar screen, said Senate Armed Services Chair Jack Reed, Dr.I., who also sits on appropriations. Forewarned is forearmed. If we should have another situation where a president wants to take money away from the military and put it into a domestic, personal, political agenda, then we should be able to stop that, Reed added. A national emergency. Without doubt, the Pentagon enjoyed immense discretion once the White House invoked its singular construction powers after declaring a national emergency in early 2019. The relevant statute, enacted in 1982 and known in political shorthand as 2808, allowed Dodd to proceed without regard to any other provision of law. But what made the ensuing process so remarkable was its lack of transparency. It hid from Congress and the federal courts the full scope of what was being tossed aside in favor of the wall spending. Deciphering the diversion was no easy matter for judges with no grounding in the appropriations process. There were repeated assurances that Dodd was only reprioritizing dollars already in its hands. If a judge asked for more details, the administration calibrated its answers to explain as little as possible. "You said reprioritize," asked U.S. Circuit Judge Daniel Collins in a 2020 hearing. "I want to understand as best I can. What actually happens? Is there a transfer and a reprogramming of money from one account to another account and then an expenditure differently? How does the money move in this case?" "No, Your Honor, there's not a transfer or a reprogramming of any kind," Collins was told by a Justice Department attorney representing the administration at the hearing. That answer was correct as far as it went. But the budget records plainly show that a big part of the story was left out. How could it be there was no reprogramming of any kind? Because DOD had exempted itself from the budget rules requiring such a reprogramming and notice to Congress. Indeed, the whole exchange was akin to a city mayor telling his local traffic court judge that he was innocent of speeding, without explaining that he'd exempted himself from the speed limits. A closer look at the budget ledgers released to Politico helps to illustrate this. The documents only apply directly to the Navy, but other military services saw the same pattern of transactions. One document dated June 18, 2019 shows the fiscal 2019 Navy appropriations proceeding on course with DOD approvals, pretty much as Congress had anticipated. But 3 months later, on Sept 16, the corresponding ledger shows an entirely different world. DOD had withdrawn its prior approvals and deferred further action on 8 overseas projects for which Congress had appropriated $205.8 million to the Navy. 2/3 of those funds carried with them statutory requirements that the dollars be spent outside the U.S. Nonetheless, DOD set out to do the opposite. The full $205.8 million was administratively realigned with a newly created project line for the wall, inserted into the Navy's construction budget under the heading CONUS Unspecified. That sum was then sub-allotted fully to the Army Corps of Engineers for construction of the wall. This allowed the Corps to immediately write checks on the Navy account, avoiding a required transfer between the two services. Sidestepping the law. Looking back, all these shortcuts were made easier by the budget exemptions assumed by DOD. The Impoundment Control Act, adopted in response to Richard Nixon's power grabs in the 1970s, went by the wayside early. That law requires a special message notification to be filed with the Government Accountability Office whenever a department defers prior appropriations, such as happened with the 8 Navy projects. No such notice was ever given, the GAO confirmed. GAO has made no ruling on the matter, but DOD's administrative realignment of the Navy funds had all the markings of a required reprogramming. As defined by GAO, a reprogramming occurs when an executive agency shifts funds within an appropriations account to use them for purposes other than those contemplated at the time of appropriation by Congress. In this case, the new Navy project line for the wall didn't even exist at the time Congress appropriated the funds in the fall of 2018. Moreover, judging from its past decisions, GAO would typically weigh the tightly prescribed rules which have long governed any changes in military construction appropriations. The Pentagon devotes pages to reprogramming procedures in its financial management regulations. Those rules are then referenced by statute in the military construction appropriations bills. And 2 of the Navy projects here, one in Germany and another in Bahrain, fell squarely in the title covered by this language in the fiscal 2019 Appropriations Act. As to the sub-allocation of Navy funds to the Army Corps, that also required some sleight of hand. In fairness to DOD, there are ample precedents where some military services sub-allot their annual construction funds to the Corps. But the procedure is so rarely used by the Navy that it's a stretch in this case, and one seemingly designed to avoid telling the courts a diversion of this size had required transfers. The Navy has its own engineering command, NAVFAC. In fact, a DOD directive, updated just a year before the diversion, designated NAVFAC to be the lead agent for Navy-funded projects in the U.S. In the past 5 years, only 13 out of 287 Navy's military construction projects required any such sub-allocation of funds to the Corps, NAVFAC told Politico. That's less than 5%, compared with the 100% sub-allocation in the wall diversion. The department used the same procedures in providing funds to the Corps of Engineers for 2,808 projects as it has used for decades, said Christopher Sherwood, a DOD spokesperson charged with defending the Comptroller's office. The components sub-allotted the funds to the Army for use by the Corps, thus all funds retain their original appropriation identification. The funds were neither transferred nor reprogrammed. Congress responds. As a West Point graduate and Armed Services Chair, Reid was most sensitive to the diversion's impact on the military, especially its personnel. From Kentucky to Maryland and North Carolina, schools, daycare facilities, and water treatment improvements were caught up in the mix, affecting troops and their families. But from his seat on appropriations, there's no ignoring that the lack of transparency is a problem, Reid said. We were not being told because their interpretation was the normal reprogramming rules did not apply because it was under 2808, he said. But again, the spirit of 2808 was that in a national security emergency, a president should have some flexibility to move funds to deal with military necessities. Trump completely disregarded this. He defied the whole spirit of the law and used it for his own political benefit. Congress took the first steps to try to reassert itself last winter, with Trump on his way out after the 2020 election. The annual defense authorization bill, enacted over the president's veto, included a House-initiated provision designed to rein in DOD's discretion under the 2808 authority. The department will still be empowered to go around current laws, but the path is narrowed some and will require more notice to Congress. Moreover, a $500 million cap is imposed for all military construction projects undertaken using the 2808 authority during a future emergency. In the event of a national emergency declaration in which 2808 authority would be used only to build projects only within the U.S., a tighter cap of $100 million would rule. Beyond this, it's not clear whether the appropriations leadership will demand further steps to ensure it is kept better informed in the future. There is a residue of bitterness toward DOD for its backhanded treatment of the panel and its staff, a stain not easily erased. The Department of Defense was not forthcoming, said Sanjeen Shaheen, DN.H., in an interview. But as a member of Appropriations, she said there has been little discussion in the panel. There are a lot of people who would like to address it, but there doesn't seem to be a bipartisan willingness to do that, Shaheen said. In fact, when the committee met this week to approve a new military construction bill, the first of the post-Trump era, the only public discussion of the wall was in reference to helping private landowners whose property was damaged by the construction. This silence illustrates how the diversion remains so identified with Trump that any further tightening of the budget rules risks being seen by Republicans as another attack on him and, implicitly, the GOP. For Senate Democrats, who know they must win over Republicans to make any progress on appropriations bills, it's become a bridge too far. Largely ignored so far is the bigger root of the dispute, the National Emergency Act. Enacted in the 1970s, it was intended to rein in White House power grabs but has since been twisted out of shape because of court decisions which put presidents like Trump in the driver's seat. Reid acknowledged the NEA may need to be revisited, but thus far it is conservative Republicans with a libertarian streak, such as Sen. Mike Lee of Utah, who have been at the forefront. Unlike many in his party, Lee was willing to challenge Trump's emergency declaration in 2019, and his so-called Article 1 bill now seeks to rein in the Emergency Act, which Trump used to open the door for DOD to use its 2808 powers. His approach is to limit future emergency declarations under the NEA to just 30 days, after which Congress would decide if they continued or not. With a Democrat now in the White House, Lee's ideas have drawn more attention from the right, worried about emergency action on climate change, for example. But Lee has found an ally also in Sen. Bernie Sanders, the Vermont independent who has included Lee's proposal as part of a much broader bill reasserting Congress's power on a range of national security issues. The SCOTUS factor. One last outlier, the U.S. Supreme Court. What the justices decide this fall could add to the calls for Congress to do more. At issue is a petition for writ of certiorari filed on Trump's behalf last year after his border wall suffered a defeat in the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in October 2020. In that decision, a three-judge panel broke 2-1 against Trump and ruled that Dodd's use of its 2808 authority violated 2808 itself because the wall projects failed to meet the military standards set in the statute. Trump sought to reverse this ruling by getting the case before the more conservative Supreme Court. It's now Biden's call, and to the dismay of the wall's challengers, the new administration has effectively lined up with Trump and is asking the justices to vacate wall-related rulings which might impede Biden's own executive powers going forward. This strategy was first seen in June, when the Solicitor General's office argued that an earlier wall ruling could become a foothold for meddlesome suits challenging the Pentagon's transfer powers. The court agreed to vacate that decision on July 2. Smelling trouble, the wall's challengers, a legal team led by the American Civil Liberties Union, the Sierra Club and other environmental interests, struck back in filings to the court on July 19. Their core argument was that much as the Pentagon may use its transfer powers on a regular basis, there is nothing so common about the use of Dodd's 2808 authority. In the plaintiff's view, the greater risk to the nation is that vacating the Ninth Circuit's decision will wipe out all its legal history and make it easier for future presidents to go down the same path as Trump did. Some of Biden's posture likely reflects the ingrained culture of the Solicitor General's office, which rarely hesitates to defend executive power. But it's a striking situation given the president's long service in the Senate, and his administration has hurt its credibility by not being more straightforward about its intentions. When Politico asked for guidance regarding the plaintiff filings, the Justice Department waited a full week before declining to comment on when it was filing a reply. Then, less than 24 hours later on Tuesday, the Solicitor General's office did file, and its position was to vacate the Ninth Circuit decision. Multiple courts have already found that Trump's fake emergency violated the Constitution, said Dror Ladine, the lead ACLU attorney on the case. I think most people would be surprised to learn that the Biden administration is still trying to erase those rulings and open the door to future presidential abuse of emergency powers.
Energy and environment. The world's top climate scientists have a new warning for Washington. The upcoming report from the IPCC is expected to lay out the scary scenarios that await the planet as temperatures continue to rise. A sign warns visitors of excessive heat conditions in Joshua Tree National Park on July 22, 2021 near 29 Palms, California. Sean Gallup, Getty Images. By Zach Coleman. The 8th of June 2021, 4:57 p.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. Congress is preparing to order the biggest U.S. investment in history for fighting climate change, hundreds of billions of dollars to clean up the power grid, fortify ecosystems and wean American drivers off fossil fuels. But scientists say it won't be nearly enough. The latest warning is set to arrive Monday from the United Nations Premier Climate Science Panel, whose findings land as wildfires ravage the West, droughts squeeze U.S. farmers. and heat waves force power companies to ration supplies, and portend even more calamitous events in the coming decades. The document will be the sixth major report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a group consisting of the world's leading climate scientists. Lawmakers pushing for an aggressive climate offensive hope the report will finally jolt some action out of Washington. Democrats have managed to include some climate measures in the Senate's $550 billion infrastructure compromise bill in the Senate and are calling for more sweeping efforts in their expected $3.5 trillion reconciliation package. This is why I'm anxious to see the IPCC report, Rep. Judy Chu D. Califf said in an interview. It seems as though it may point to tipping point disasters that could warn that we have far less time than previously thought. Chu added, I do not think that Washington, D.C. as a whole understands the implications for not investing in climate change measures right this minute. Previous IPCC assessments have eliminated many of the scientific uncertainties that skeptical politicians clung to when rejecting policies that came with high price tags and threatened to disrupt the oil, gas and coal industries. Now, the scientists' focus is on how fast, not if, the disastrous changes to the Earth's climate will occur, how people will adapt to them and how governments can ease the worst impacts. Aiding that research is a new field of science that seeks to connect global climate trends to tangible real-world impacts, which is expected to feature in Monday's IPCC report. Scientists who were once wary of tying specific weather disasters to climate change are growing more confident about linking the growing frequency of events to warming temperatures, offering more precise guidance for the policy makers and legislators. Both Democratic and Republican lawmakers say they are concerned about climate change. But advocates for strong policy action acknowledge the political window is rapidly closing as the Senate and House gear up for elections in 2022, when campaigning is likely to overshadow any serious legislative work. Even before electioneering chokes off debate, the Biden administration is hoping to land a signature legislative climate victory to take with it to November's international climate talks in Glasgow, Scotland, as evidence of U.S. commitment on climate change. So far, aside from big promises and executive actions, President Joe Biden has little to show to make the case that the U.S. can lead the global efforts. Activists complain the bipartisan infrastructure plan heading for an expected vote in the Senate would spend too little on climate. That would make the envisioned $3.5 trillion Democrats' only reconciliation plan the last best shot, if the party can persuade skeptical centrists to support it. I actually think we're on the verge of a tipping point where we're really jumping in and hopefully, over the course of this month, we set the president up to go to Glasgow and show progress and say, all right, all of us now have to make bigger, more substantive commitments, Sen Martin Heinrich DNM said. It's the most important chance we have. The bipartisan infrastructure plan won't be anywhere close to enough to counter the climate threat, according to scientists and Democratic lawmakers. And though it represents a major win for Biden on the domestic stage, passing only that legislation without the larger $3.5 trillion package would leave the U.S. in a weak position to cajole other countries like China and India to strengthen their climate efforts. While the Senate infrastructure bill would devote tens of billions of dollars to coastal resilience, wildfire management, clean hydrogen, carbon capture and battery research, it would provide only a fraction of what Biden initially proposed to spend on installing a network of electric vehicle charging stations. Instead, critics say, it would expand highways that studies show encourage more driving. Even with the down payment that Congress is making on Biden's plans to aggressively shrink carbon emissions from power plants and tailpipes, the IPCC report is likely to call for ever more stringent cuts to keep the planet temperatures from rising 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial revolution levels. Such a cap was the most ambitious target of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. The Earth's atmosphere is operating on a carbon budget with very little headroom left before the world would cross that 1.5 degree threshold, a level that's likely to imperil many low-lying island nations. Doing so would lock in sea level rises and contribute to feedback loops that make it harder to stem further temperature increases. Even leaders who crafted the Paris Climate Agreement acknowledged individual nations will need to speed their efforts to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions if they even want to avoid breaching the deal's less stringent 2 degrees target. Based on current government targets, the world is on pace to see temperatures climb 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. The world already has warmed 1.2 degrees Celsius since the Industrial Revolution. But the chasm between strategies of the progressives and moderates inside the Democratic Party for dealing with the problem is putting its thin majority and the Biden administration in a bind. With Sen. Kirsten Sinema, de Arizona, the latest lawmaker to express her opposition to the framework. Sinema's resistance to passing a package as large as $3.5 trillion has prompted a backlash from progressives, who worry that the party's moderates may squander the opportunity if they allow a single lawmaker to dictate the terms of the package. "I just don't subscribe to a reality where she makes all the decisions," Rep. Jared Huffman, D. Calif. said. Sinema's office did not reply to a request for comment. Though the infrastructure plan drew support from moderate Republicans who have been seen as amenable to modest steps to combat climate action. The more aggressive action under consideration in the much larger bill, like a clean energy standard that squeezes fossil fuels, aren't expected to win any GOP members. That type of shove-it-down-your-throats, unilateral climate offensive is less likely to be durable if Republicans return to power, said Corey Schroet, legislative affairs manager with the nonpartisan think tank Niskanen Center. While he said more aggressive action on climate is needed, Schroet praised the bipartisan infrastructure deal for its climate provisions. But progressives derided it as too weak. Trying to appease Democratic moderates while attracting Republican votes has shackled the responses to climate change they've called for, leaving the U.S. and world short of necessary steps to rein in emissions, said Lauren Mao, news advocacy director with the youth-led progressive environmental group Sunrise Movement. There's still this stick of we need to hold on to bipartisanship in order to govern, even though that is completely out of touch with the majority of the American public that voted for Biden and support mostly Democratic policies, she said. There's just a sort of gap in the logical scientific understanding of what's actually required to stave off the worst of the climate crisis. And we're talking about the worst. What we're dealing with now is far from the worst. But Tony Lazarowicz, director of the Yale Project on Climate Communication, disputed progressives' notion that Republicans would hesitate to reverse Democratic-only climate legislation if they return to power. Progressives cite broad public support for climate action, but Lazarowicz said that's not a sophisticated look at the polling. Opposition from conservatives for climate action remains strong, he said. And it's only the rising support from liberal Democrats and growing interest from independents that almost entirely explains climate change's ascension among national priorities. Republican sentiment has remained low and flat for more than a decade, Lazarowicz said. And yet, bipartisanship might also relegate the planet to a losing position in the climate change fight, he said, because the issue is not important to GOP voters, making it virtually impossible to secure buy-in from Republican legislators. That sentiment is clear to top Republican lawmakers like Wyoming Sen. John Barrasso, the ranking Republican on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. All the polling that we're doing is showing concerns with the economy, concerns with crime, concerns with the border, and all of those issues are ones that President Biden's administration is polling poorly, he told Politico. Adding that he would do everything I physically can to stop Senate Democrats' $3.5 trillion spending plan.